Well, hello everyone, and thank you for coming to my channel. I am Shatina Byer, author of The Spirit of a Sound Mind. I am very excited today because I am interviewing Miss Shannon Lou Carter. Shannon wrote a book on grief and loss, and so today's workshop is going to be going through various different questions about her journey with loss so that she can answer some questions for us. So we hope that you will share this video. We believe it's going to be a blessing to you. Welcome, Shannon.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I must say that I have purchased multiple copies of Shannon's book. You know, when we're talking about grief and loss, it can be a very sensitive subject. But I loved how she applied love to such a hurtful subject. Right from the beginning, she talked about a love story.
Yes,
And to be honest, you can only grieve when you've had feelings involved
exactly.
with someone or something. So we have some questions that are outlined. I want to encourage you all. Ms. Shannon can share her information at the end as to how you can get this book. I personally have not only purchased a book for myself, but for others as well, and they're being blessed by it. So one of the first questions that I wanted to ask you was, what inspired you to write your book?
There were multiple things. First of all, writing is cathartic for me. And so going through the process of what we were going through my mom's illness, and then eventually when she left us, and that's the way I choose to still say it, it was cathartic for me to write, but I often use Facebook postings. And so people would come on and they would share comments, and I realized that there were other people taking this journey with me. And so not only was the writing cathartic for me, but much of what I was writing I found was healing for other people. And there were other people saying, we need this in a book, can you please share this? And it just went from there.
Wow, that's awesome. So that's an important point, that we're not alone in our journey.
Definitely.
And community is very important.
Definitely.
Very important. Did you have any reservations about sharing your story?
I didn't, not as far as about sharing my story. I wanted to be very careful, however, and very cautious, because I realized that it was more than just my story. And so I wanted to make sure, one of the things that I deal with in the book is not just the concept of grief and loss, but my mother and I had such a relationship where we needed to come to healing, we needed to come to wholeness. And so I wanted to share our story, but in a way that I knew would honor her, and also in a way that I knew would not be hurtful for any of my family members that were still left here.
And that's a very, very important point, because different people that are in different capacities, say for instance with a person, may have different viewpoints of that person. I know for myself, different people in my family that have gone on recognize that those individuals in different capacities than I did.
Right.
But yet what I needed to grieve and what I needed to talk about was helpful and unique for me. So coming out with your story does require sometimes a lot of courage.
Definitely.
So we thank you for writing that, and the community that supported you with that. So what does grief mean to you?
I think in its most simplistic terms, to me, grief is just simply the pain of loss. And so when we use the word grief, we often generalize it to losing a family member or a loved one passing on. But it's just the pain of loss. I have grieved losing a job. I shared with you earlier, I watched my 9-year-old daughter, one of her closest and best friends, moved away, and my daughter realized she wasn't going to see her anymore. And she grieved, and I had to support her through that grieving process, just in the loss of that friend and that friendship. So I think for me, grief in its most simplistic term, it's just dealing with the pain of loss.
That's good. And I like a word that you said in there, process. So Shannon and I have facilitated other groups before where we've talked about a grief and loss model, the Elizabeth Kubler-Ross model, as to where she outlines 5 different stages. The first stage is denial. Okay, denial can be at its core is an avoidance. That avoidance can be subtle, so deflecting or redirecting the conversation if someone brings up a topic avoiding going to the house of the loved one, avoiding going down the street of the loved one. It can be blatant as to where, we literally say, I don't want to talk about it.
Right.
The second stage is anger. And I think an important point is that sometimes we're not angry with the people that remain, and sometimes we're not necessarily angry with the people who left, but we're angry at the situation.
Right, exactly.
Although sometimes people can feel angry with their loved one. Say, for instance, if their loved one passed away from unkept health, or some people withhold health information, and then the survivors find out, okay, you were struggling with this condition or with this disease, and you didn't tell us, you didn't allow us to help with medical intervention, and now you're not here.
Right.
And we're living without you. So that sort of anger that can even be more toxic sometimes because you can't necessarily express it directly to that one.
Right.
So you feel like you're just bottling it up and holding it in. The third stage is bargaining, and that's where people are trying to bring meaning to their loss. They're trying to understand, why did this happen? The couldas, the wouldas, the shouldas. Is there something I could have done differently? If I had made them go to the doctors, if I had did this, if I had known earlier, all those kinds of things. The fourth stage is depression, and that is a very real stage. Depression can come in degrees. It can be mild, it can be moderate, it can be severe. Certainly when it gets to be at the more severe end of it, that can be, very concerning. Sometimes people have thoughts of not wanting to live, the thought of, I don't want to be here. And sometimes there's a distinction between sort of ideation of death, as opposed to having a plan to end one's life. So when people have ideations, it may be, I just want to be where my loved one is.
Right.
I don't necessarily have a plan to end my life, but I am not getting the level of enjoyment out of life.
Exactly.
And then that fifth stage is acceptance. And so I think, to your point, the journey is to try to deal successfully with all of those stages and to try to get to a place of acceptance. And acceptance can look like a lot of different things for a lot of people, depending upon what the loss is. So for some people, loss may mean acceptance connected to that loss may mean I may not be able to be in relationship with this person because there was a violation of hurt and pain, and maybe it's a safety concern. So acceptance means I am no longer holding against you what you did to me.
Right.
But I accept that I can't be in close proximity with you. I have forgiven you. I have released you, though. So the journey and the process. Thank you for that. I think the next piece is also very important. Healthy, biblical sound suggestions that you would refer to in your book that you would want to encourage people to use to help them in this process.
I think one of the greatest one of the things that I made it a priority to do was weave biblical principles all throughout the book. My greatest, and that I am still walking in now, is in the book of Hebrews, the 4th chapter, when the Bible says, come boldly before the throne of grace, that you might find help in your time of need. I said to someone earlier today, even in just preparing to do this interview, I've been quoting the scripture for years, where God told Paul, my strength is made perfect in your weakness, and my grace is sufficient. And I'm realizing now, over this past more than a year, I am literally having to boldly go to God and say, whoa, I need you real bad right now. And I'm having to walk in the strength of God, because there were areas that Shannon was always quick to wear the red cape. And so sometimes when you finally reach that point in life where you have you don't even have the ability to take your red cape off, it's stripped from you. And now understanding that sometimes day by day, I am literally getting by in the strength of God. And I think sometimes as church people, we become very churchy, and we want to say the right things. I have dealt with friends and family members in church, and they're just like, oh, I'm good. And they'll quote scripture, but you can look in their eyes and see you're broken and you're shattered, and you want the whole wide world to think that you're just this deep, churchy statue. And at the end of the day, God is saying, but I know your heart is broken. And everybody else knows your heart is broken. So just be honest.
Right.
And that's what I had to learn. I had to just be honest and break before God so that he could put me back together again.
Right. Awesome. Awesome. That honesty piece is something that is, I think, very important, because whether it's for religious reasons or whether it's for cultural reasons, sometimes honesty is not always comfortable for people. You know, when we look at, things that may have occurred where people have experienced a loss, say, for instance, some type of abuse within the family system, and the message is either told directly or indirectly, you don't talk about what happens outside of this home.
Yeah.
You keep, what stays in the home, what happens in the home stays in the home. And so that facade,
Right. Exactly.
like we were talking earlier, with childhood, sometimes things can develop in childhood that can sort of mark how people form their personality, particularly if it happens in the formative years. So now there's a situation that occurs in childhood to where it's important to that individual, no matter their age,
Right.
but they're told, again, either directly or indirectly, through shunning from the family members, or just sort of withholding affection. You don't talk about these things.
Exactly.
So people get the message, I don't talk about what I'm going through. And I have to pretend like everything is okay, because I can't handle that it's not okay.
Right.
So that honesty is very important. And one of the things that I put on the back cover of my book was Jesus, when he was on his way to the cross, he told his disciples, my soul is exceedingly sorrowful,
Yeah.
even unto death. And so particularly for the faith-based community, he is our model.
Right.
And if he came to the point where he could be honest with trusted individuals, because sometimes we can't be that transparent with everyone.
Exactly.
That's sometimes a situation we have to deal with. But when we find those people that are placed in our lives where we can be transparent, there is a time and a place to be able to say, you know what, I'm really not okay.
Yes.
I know that I will be, but right now I'm not.
Right.
I'm
Exactly.
not.
Exactly. I always tell people, when we were going through with my mom, my dad did something I didn't understand at the time, but I get it more and more now. And so people would call the house and they would say, how are you? And he would say, I'm not okay, but I'm all right. And like, to me, logically, it didn't make sense. And finally, he explained to me, and he said, I'm not okay with this situation. And in my emotions, I'm not doing okay right now, but I'm all right in the peace of God. And I understand that all is well, no matter what. And I think that's the thing, when we can understand that difference and knowing how to be all right in the peace of God, but being willing to admit, I'm not okay. I would hate it. I put it in the book. When I went through it and people would say, how are you? There was something about that question that triggered me. It triggered me because I didn't want to answer. And so people would say, how are you? And I would change the subject. Or I would look at them and say, well, how are you? Because I didn't want to answer the question. Because I didn't know how to.
Right. That's good. That's good. That's good. That's good. That's good. That's good. Sometimes people don't really know what to say.
Yeah.
Right? So that's very good. How would you suggest people respond? Because sometimes people do go through that period of as to where the loved one is gone, right? And so the inundation with cards and with people being around, that's come to an end, and now I have to go back into public, be it back to church, be it back to work, back into the community, and those questions are going to come. How would you encourage people to be in a place where they can be okay with their answers? Not because sometimes when you're hurting so much, you feel like I can't get into it because you really can't handle where I'm at.
Yeah.
You really can't handle where I'm at.
Right.
So for everybody's sake, I'm gonna just deflect from that. So how would you encourage people? What are some ways in which, and maybe this can be something we talk about at the end, but ways in which people can handle those kinds of situations that are highly anticipated and somewhat awkward, but are a part of life? And to be honest, sometimes that's why we avoid situations, or I'm not going because I already know what's going to happen. Thanksgiving or different holidays, anniversaries that come up. I already know what's going to happen.
Exactly. For me, I did a lot of the avoidance. And because my my parents were co-pastors. And so I also had to deal with, I'm grieving my mother, but at the same hand, my dad explained to me, and I got it, the people at the church were also grieving her. And so what would happen was, when I finally went back to church, people would come to me after church and they would want to hug me, and I knew that they were just trying to show love. But I didn't know, I was in a place. And so literally, as soon as we would say amen, I'd go to the car. Just because I can't right now. And so I did a lot of avoidance, and I'm grateful for the people in my life who understood and just knew I just needed my space. And then I got to the next level where I could be honest. And sometimes people would say to me, "How are you?" And I would say, "I don't know right now." Or sometimes people would say, "How are you?" And I would say, "Depends on when you ask me." And people that knew me enough to love me accepted those answers. There was one lady, and it was your cousin, Jamila. And I say her name because she and I laugh about it all the time, because Jamila called on the phone, and I think we were actually planning my mom's service or something. And because she is like family to me, I could go to a certain level with her. And so when I answered the phone, she said, "Hey, how you doing?" And before I caught myself out of my mouth, I said, "Jamila, that's just the stupidest question anybody has ever asked me." In that moment, the two of us cracked up laughing. We laughed, and she said, "Yeah, you're right. Okay, what can I do for you?" Well, what neither one of us knew at that time was, I think like 2 weeks after I lost my mom, she lost her mom. So when I walked in church, I looked at her and I said, "I'm not even gonna ask you how you're doing." And we laughed. And so I think having those people around you that you can be real with, that you can be honest and just say, "I don't even know how I'm doing." And they don't ask any more questions. They don't push it. Because sometimes when you're in that moment, I don't even want you trying to tell me how to do better. Just let me do what I'm doing. Let me do how I'm doing. Let me be where I am. And so I think you have to be honest with people.
Good. And I think it's important to know that denial is a normal stage. Sometimes we need to not deal head on with a situation, and that's okay. That's okay. It's okay. Those 5 models that we went through, they're normal stages of grief and loss. What we do want to talk about is how we can recognize when something gets into it not being okay.
Exactly.
Because it can cross over into a point where it's just like, I'm really not okay. Yeah. No, that's good. So the next question is, does grief actually get better? And I know you wrote you wouldn't use the word better. Does it in your perspective, does it improve? Does the weight lessen at all?
I think it changes, and that's why I said I don't know if I would say better. It changes. In complete transparency, sitting here in this chair in this moment, in this second, I don't even know if I can answer that question. And it's because I feel like for me to say to somebody the grief gets better, I almost feel like I'm telling somebody their end destination when I'm still going through the journey. And so from Shannon's perspective, I don't know if I could say my grief has gotten better. It changes so that it's not as debilitating. So yes, I'm talking myself through that. So the answer to your question is, you do reach a point where it's not such a heavy weight. So I went from I can't get up off my couch because I'm laying on my couch crying all the time, and I don't have the energy to do anything, to then, okay, Shannon, take a shower and put some clothes on. I went from my father saying to me, "You cannot stay locked in this house. You got to get out and do something." And so now I'm able to do that. But I think for me, the struggle, and the reason I said I don't know if I would say it gets better, is because what I'm finding is you can think you're better. And then all of a sudden, out of the clear blue sky, this tidal wave will just come and completely rush you over. And you're just like, but I thought I went better. And I think sometimes we take grief and we put it in the stage of, okay, after this amount of time, I should be healed. I should be better. And then when something comes back and knocks you over, you question yourself. And so I don't know if I would say better, but I think it does change. It does lighten.
So there's improvement.
Yes.
Improvement. And I think you mentioned an important piece in there in terms of someone from the outside saying, this is starting to debilitate you.
Yes.
So I'm going to help point this out to you. And that goes to the overall purpose of this, to be able to have community, to be able to have people that you can trust that are around you, to be able to say, you know what, maybe you didn't notice it, maybe you didn't recognize it, but you've been staying in for a while. I noticed that, when I come over, the lights are off all the time, or you're not answering calls, or you're not doing this and you're not doing that. And so I think that while we don't always necessarily have a prescribed time per se, some people will say a year, certainly from a clinical perspective, there are prescribed times as to where there's a sort of determined time frame when heavy grief should change before it goes into what they call clinical depression. So there are some time frames that are out there, but I do think, though, being able to have people on the outside that can say, you know what, maybe you didn't recognize it, but I've noticed it, to keep it from going over into a lifestyle. I've come across people that have lost, say for instance, a child or whatever the case may be, and they sort of stop living right there emotionally. They may have gone through the motions of life, but psychologically and emotionally, that's where they stopped. They stopped enjoying life. They stopped enjoying other people. They just stopped. And so it's not a judgment. It's just a recognition that, sometimes if you don't have someone to say, come on, let's come out of this. Let's try to grieve in a different way, maybe even.
Right.
Not even to say that you can't grieve, but what does that look like now in this season,
Definitely.
What can we do to change some of the ways in which we're grieving? A next question that comes up, which I also think is significant, can you love again? It's very common for us to sort of put our walls up, our guards up, right? And we can tell when we're guarded, right? Like I'm big on introspection. That's a term to where you sort of are in tune with yourself and you look inward. And so you can kind of feel when your walls are going up, right? And if you're sensitive to atmosphere, you can sense when people's walls are going up. And you may not even know them. And you may feel like, okay, I just hit something right there. Not sure what that is. And so it's a protective factor.
Yeah.
It's a protective factor because we don't want to feel that hurt again. So from your perspective, do you feel like in the journey that people can come to a point where they can say, you know what, I can love again, I can trust again?
Definitely, yes. And as we talked about, when we talk about grief, it's such a large gamut. But even for me, there were different aspects. So in dealing with the loss of my mother, it was almost just the opposite of that. It was such an eye-opening experience for me that it made me more determined to love more, love richer, love harder, because I recognized that frailty of, I don't know when I might lose you. So I gotta love you hard while you're here. Because I look at how much time my mom and I wasted not loving. We loved, but we didn't know how to be authentic in our communication and show that love. So I wasted so much of that time. But I also understand people who struggle in maybe there's a grief of a relationship and now you've hurt me and I'm grieving in that. So it makes me a little bit more cautious. But I always say, and even when I got this question, I really thought about it and prayed about it. And one of the things that really dropped in my spirit was, when you make the decision to stop loving, you make the choice to stop living.
That's good.
That is a choice to stop living. You can only live a full and productive and effective life when you allow yourself to be open to love in its purest sense.
And so we are talking a lot about God and about faith because we are, Christians. And I think it's important to recognize that, while everyone is going to go through grief and loss in life, there is a sense that when you don't grieve with hope, that grief is different.
Yeah.
Because where do you turn when you don't have a hope?
Yeah.
When you don't have hope for the future, or when you don't have hope for anything anymore, that in and of itself is a dangerous place to be in. And so I would just want to encourage, individuals who are going to view this to be able to evaluate, what is your hope?
Exactly.
What is your hope? And oftentimes what we come to find through grief is that people will leave one way or the other, either from change of life, whatever the case may be, or from death, the ultimate separation on this side. So if our hope are in people,
Right.
then we're really in a bad place.
Exactly.
If the only thing I can hope in is a person in terms of just flesh and blood, then that's a pretty frail place to be in, because people will fail, they will leave one way or the another. So I would just encourage you to sort of think about what is your hope really in. And it's okay to be able to ask God. I've had a couple of significant deaths that had happened in my life that were defining for me. One was when I was in my late teens. My best friend died. And we were very close. And he had some health complications, and he died in his bedroom. He was on some medications that conflicted with each other. It induced his heart, and he had a heart attack. And I was actually at Bible study the night that he died. And I remember very vividly, it was probably about 6 p.m. And I just kind of had this heaviness, this sense of heaviness. I didn't know what it was. I wasn't trying to be deep, as we say. I just felt very heavy, and I put my head down. And as it turned out, that was the time that he died. And so while I had been raised in the church, I did not at that time have a personal sort of relationship with God.
Wow.
And so I remember, for me, what hurt me, you said the "how are you" question was a trigger for you. For me, a trigger was, you're going to be okay.
Mm-hmm.
That was a trigger for me.
Yeah.
Because it was like, you cannot understand what I'm feeling.
Yeah.
I felt it was cavalier. I felt it was insensitive. Like, you cannot understand what I'm going through to just sort of cavalier tell me I'm going to be okay.
Yeah.
Like, you can't, And so I remember taking a nap one day, and to show you when the time frame was, Kirk Franklin had just came out with his album, What You Looking For.
Wow.
And my mom had brought me a cassette, not a CD, a cassette tape. And I remember before I put the cassette on, I remember praying. And I remember saying to God, I don't know if you really will. I believe you are. But if you are, I really need you right now, because I was hurting that bad. And I think it's important to know that you can get to a point where life will hurt you that bad.
Yeah.
And it's so important to be careful what you turn to when you're that low and when you're hurting that bad. I needed something. Now, thankfully, I had been raised in the church, and so I knew that I could turn to God, even though I was still trying to figure out what he meant to me. And so I took a nap, and when I woke up, I remember feeling such a weight lifted off me. And I knew that he was gone, and it was, so if I had to do it in terms of measurements, before I went to take the nap, I would say I was at 99.9. When I woke up, I was probably at a 10. It was such a drastic change in how I felt that for me, I knew that was an answered prayer. So I think it's also important to know that, if you're conflicted about God, or if you're not sure about all this God talk, you can pray and ask God to show you in your individual way what you want him to do for you to help you through your grieving process.
Definitely.
So that leads right into the next question. Were you ever angry with God about your loved one being gone?
I don't think I would use the word angry. But there was definitely a sense of frustration and perplexity. And once again, I promised you complete transparency. I still now have to work really hard because sometimes I'll be watching a commercial or I'll hear somebody in church and I'll hear somebody say they're a breast cancer survivor.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah, and it's a struggle because I've grown up in the church. I've grown up faith-based.
Yeah.
And so there's that point in life where you reach the honesty of saying, you spend all your life saying God is able. And then you hit that moment of facing the balance of God is able, but yet recognizing his sovereignty.
Right.
And to know and to say to yourself, I know that you're able, but you chose not to do this for me.
Right.
It's a battle.
Right.
It's a battle.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. So when my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, when she passed away and she led me to the Lord, I lived with my maternal grandparents when I was very young until I went to school. And so when she passed away from her health conditions, immediately the thoughts came into my mind of, you know, what does this mean for your faith? This is the person that led you to God. And if something like this could happen to her, what does that mean? And I remember shortly thereafter going to a conference in Missouri, and a woman of God, Darlene Bishop, was on stage, and she survived breast cancer. And obviously, we don't begrudge the people who overcame. We're just conflicted in that moment.
Right.
And so I'm in Missouri, and I'm at this awesome conference, and it's thousands of people there, and this awesome woman of God is on stage talking about how she had breast cancer, and to the point where she was very graphic with it. You know, she said that her breast was literally bleeding. And she said she told God as she washed out her nightgown in the sink, that she said she told God her breast could fall right off into the sink and it was not going to change how she served him. And she you know, obviously went on to recover and went on to talk about other healings that came to other family members. And so you sit there, and of course you don't wish somebody else would die, but you're just grappling with the fact, why not my family? Because I felt like if anybody had faith, I mean, I hear this woman on stage, but I knew my grandmother. So it's like,
I sometimes question, like, do they have two heads or something? That they
Right.
take all good, you know,
Yeah.
benefits or something.
It will. And I, like, to your point, my mother was a woman. I think for me, what caused my struggle the greatest is I know of people today who, when they got their cancer diagnosis, they called my mother. And my mother prayed for them and God healed them. And that was a battle.
Yeah.
Because there are people still here today that she prayed and God healed them and he took her.
Right.
And I still battle.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I think when, you know, we're trying to help other people, it's okay to not feel like we have to have the answers.
Exactly.
There was a mother, this is going back some years, and she had already lost one son. And everybody had come from the church and was waiting for, because he had gotten married, and we were at what was going to be the reception. And literally people found out in their commute he dropped dead, changing from his wedding attire into his reception attire. So you had people who had just left the church and come to the reception site to find out that and so I was one of the first responders, as it were, and here it is, you know, obviously haven't traveled the same length of years that this mother has traveled, haven't had to have any loss of a child, and to be honest, nobody wants to. That's another thing too, to be honest. You know, you want to share with people, but you think, I don't want to have to experientially understand what that's like. And so here it is, this mother grieving, and I remember she was just rocking and moaning. She was just rocking and moaning. She had already lost a son, and now her second son, or another one of her sons, had died that day. And I was comfortable with the fact of, because what can I say?
Right.
So I was comfortable with just being there and just rubbing her back. And I think sometimes that's important to know, that grief will look like different things for different people, but to whatever is authentically you, if it's just to be there, if it's just to say, I love you, if it's just to say, I'll listen, I'll pray with you, I'll pray for you, we don't have to feel the pressure of I have to solve this.
Exactly.
And I think that's important to know, because sometimes we can't solve it. We can't try to manufacture answers to make someone feel good because we want to feel like we're doing something.
Exactly. I'm learning that now, even through my dad and I have very transparent conversations. And so when we lost my mom, my girls and I had moved in at the time to help take care of her, and I didn't want to go home. And he finally had a conversation with me, and he reminds me now, you know, sometimes I'll say, well, I got to take care of Daddy. I don't want to be by myself. And sometimes he'll say to me, the pain that I feel now, you can't fix. And it took me a bit to grasp that and to really understand that sometimes, even in trying to be there, like you can't fix it.
Right.
You just can't. You want to.
Right.
You love that person.
Right.
And then being on the other side to understand, sometimes I gotta feel this. I gotta feel this, and there's nobody that can fix it but God.
Right. Absolutely. How did the loss impact your faith?
It changed my faith because it caused me initially not so much to question my faith, but to question the real definition of faith. And what is faith? Because growing up in the church, we've always taught about faith, we've talked about faith, and we've talked about having faith for things, or having faith for God to do things. And what I finally came to realize, and I talk about this in the book, what I finally came to realize is my real faith has nothing to do with what God does. My real faith is in who God is.
Yeah.
My real faith has nothing to do with me getting what I want, not getting what I want. My real faith is just in understanding that there is a God, and that there is a God that loves me. There is a God that knows what he's doing despite my situation. And the only way that I can get through life is by having faith in that God, not in what he does, but in who he is.
Right.
So it definitely changed my faith drastically.
That's good. You know, when my grandmother passed away, when we looked at the caller ID, we saw a sort of repetition of the same numbers. My mother's number, my aunt's number, my uncle's number. Maybe different orders, but the same numbers over and over and over. And we leaned on her so. You know, I remember asking my grandmother questions, and I would say, Grandma, you know, what do you think about this? And, you know, she would say, well, did you pray? And I would say, no, Grandma, but just tell me. You know, it was like I sidetracked. It was like, I know, but no, okay, just tell me the answer.
Excuse me.
Tell me what you think. And so oftentimes when those props are removed from us, you know, a prop, you know, when someone's on crutches, they have those crutches to prop them up and to walk. And so when those crutches are gone, help with balance. When the doctor says your props, we need to take them, you're okay to walk on your own. You may not walk as fast. You may not run right now, but we can take the props. You can walk now. And so we find that whole process of walking now, it's uncomfortable.
Very.
Because I'm walking with something that I've had all of the time. Those props sometimes have been there since childhood. You know, I was very, very close with my grandmother. And I remember as an adult, you know, after she had passed, I was at a gas station and I was pumping gas. And I remember this feeling of, I felt like a little child lost in this big world. I felt like, who's going to ask me every day, how was my day? And it's a difference when you ask somebody how's their day and you really want to know. We say, how was your day as a greeting? How you doing as a greeting? We really don't always want to hear it, you know, to be honest. But when my grandmother would say, how are you doing? She meant it. It didn't matter what she was doing. It didn't matter what time of day it was. When she said, how are you doing? She meant it. She was all ears. She was all in. And so all of those things that we get used to, sometimes they're taken away from us.
Yeah.
But I love what you said about how it changed the faith. And I thought of the scripture in Jude where it says that we're contending for the faith
Yeah.
that was once delivered to the saints. And so when you think about what it takes to pull you through life, it's certainly not, well, did I get the car that I wanted? Did I get the
Right.
jacket that I wanted? It's really about our faith in God. And we can see that contrast of if we can rejoice, and this is the real test of faith, we can rejoice when he says yes, when he does provide that healing, when he does manifest the answers that we want. But then the contrast, when we pray and he says no,
Yeah.
or he doesn't respond. I mean, we read about Daniel in the lion's den, he was rescued, but there were plenty of apostles that they were not delivered from death. They tasted death, literally. So we do see that contrast. A few more questions and then we'll be wrapping up. Where is my loved one now? I think that sometimes that's a very confusing place to be in, particularly if you don't really know much about God, all right? And all you know is that physically they're not here. And so sometimes, I try to keep things biblically rooted, but, people can get into a lot of mysticism things
Yeah.
that aren't necessarily biblical, that I think can also open up doors that may not, because then people go to fortune tellers and...
Yeah, say that I'm spiritual.
Right,
Yeah.
What that means.
right. All those sorts of things, because they're so desperate
Mm-hmm.
to try to keep a connection with their loved one.
Yeah, yeah.
And you're definitely right. I went through that because, as you said, my family has suffered. I actually have written, multiple books, but I also wrote a book when we lost my sister. And so in the loss of my mother, it was a little bit different because I know the life my mother lived. I know how my mother loved God. I know so there was no question for me. If there's a heaven, she's there.
Right.
And the loss of my sister was a little bit different. And I didn't have that surety. But I have finally reached a place. I finally reached a point where we always say, oh, I want to see my mother again. There are songs, I'm going to see my mother over there. And, when people leave us or they leave this world, we say we're going to see them again. I am finally now coming to a place of recognizing and saying, my mother lived the life that she needed to live to guarantee that she would see Jesus.
Yes.
Now that's what I have to do. And so I can't live a life anymore based on seeing my mother again.
Right.
Can't live a life anymore based on seeing my sister again, because we don't like to not know.
Right.
But it's our nature to want to know. We don't like to not know.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, and you mentioned this earlier, sometimes I just have to say, I don't know.
Right.
So for me, it became not so much, am I going to see them again?
Mm-hmm.
When I get up every day and I put my feet on the floor every day, it's not with the concept of seeing my mother again when I get to heaven. It's because when I close these eyes for the last time, I need to know that I'm going to see Jesus.
Yes.
And if I live a life like that, then it gives me the peace with not knowing the other pieces of the puzzle.
That's good. That's good. That's good. And I think that is also an encouragement to be able to witness whenever we can, because we don't know someone's last moment, and we want to be able to make sure that we've done everything that we can through our lifestyle, through our spoken word, to encourage them to get to know Christ.
Exactly.
Because that is our faith and that is our hope. And one of the last questions here, we can kind of merge these two. What do we feel like, what do we do when we feel like we can't go on? So I think also too, there's a very real place as to where we can go to church, right? We can hear all of these things. We can hear all of these testimonies. And it's easy to be strong when you're around people, right? But inevitably, we have those moments where you're alone, right? You have those moments where you're just alone. And it could be physically or it could be psychologically. Feeling alone is not just the absence of other people. It's more also a psychological state. So I'm around people, but I don't feel connected.
Right.
I'm here, but I'm not here. So what would you offer to people when they feel like, I've heard all of this, and so that's your strength, right? Maybe you're just cut from a different cloth. Maybe you have this church background. Maybe it's easier for you to go on, but that's not me. That's not my testimony, or that's not my situation. So, what would you offer to people on a variety of different life walks, from church, not from church? I just feel like I've heard all of that. I believe it's happening for them, but I just don't feel like I can take another step. What would you say to people when they're in that moment?
I think, first of all, it's so much bigger than church. And I have to be honest, I don't know how to tell somebody to get through it outside of God.
Right.
I don't know how people get through it outside of God.
Right.
I do say to people, even when you have God as your foundation, there are times, I say all the time, people used to say, just take it one day at a time. And I reached a point where I couldn't, the day was too big. I had to take it 1 second, one breath at a time. But going back to even the scripture that I quoted earlier, that Hebrews 4, come boldly before the throne of grace. There is a God who says, I'm sitting here watching you hurting, and I just want to love you.
Yeah.
I have 2 children, and my youngest, sometimes I watch her struggle, and I say, but if you just would have let mommy help you. And so in saying honestly, there is a God who, you don't have to have a church background, you don't have to have grown up in church. There is a God who understands your pain and your hurt and your suffering and your grief in a way that you couldn't even imagine. That is waiting for you to just say, just like your story, to just say, okay, God, if you're real, I need you to get me through this. And if you go to him with sincerity, I can guarantee you. I can guarantee you, because I've had to do it. And I didn't have to do it based on church background. I didn't have to do it because of, I tell people, my parents had their own testimony. I have to live mine. And I have had to go to God for myself and say, if you don't step in real quick now, I'm not going to make it to the next 2 minutes. And he stepped in. And then I made it to the next 2 minutes, and then I made it through the 30 minutes, and then I made it through the hour, and then before I knew it, I had made it through the day.
That's good. Very good. Are there any questions from our audience or comments, or we can go offline and you can...
First of all, just thank you for your testimony. It's a blessing to be here and be able to listen to you. Those 2 young girls, I'm sure that today, with everything that we're hearing, is just, we're going to cherish that day for the rest of our life, for sure, because we learned a lot. And already, we know that we have now coping mechanisms that we can use. And thank you really for that. For me, like, even right now, that's my mom jacket that I'm wearing. And just yesterday, even, in the car with the church music and everything, and just, like you said, you're thinking that you're doing okay, life now is going smoothly, and then it just took only one word in that song, and I lost it. And I was like, oh my God. But every time that I get to that point, I agree. Prayers just help me go to, because I'm asking myself too, especially when I tell them, I notice you're not going to church when you should go, or things like that. I wonder how people that don't go to church, how they go through it, because it's really a real pain. It's there, but sincerely with knowing God, or try to know him and get closer and loving him, he does answer prayers. So yeah. So hopefully now they heard it from somebody else. Maybe that will sound differently to them, because
Yeah. And people deal with it in their own ways. My children are younger, but their grandmother was their world.
Yeah.
And then they were there with us as we were taking care of her. So they were there in her last days. And I was so busy trying to get me through it and trying to get my dad through it.
Yeah.
I did not understand how it had affected my children.
That's why we're here.
Yeah.
Because I didn't know at what degree they were going through it. I thought they just looking at me and say, look at mom, lost her mom. And I knew they were close to her, but I didn't think that they were really processing it differently, going through it deeply, being in pain until start feeling that, okay, she's always in her room. That's not her. She's the free spirit of the family. So what is happening to this one? Don't want to go anywhere. I don't want to eat. I just want to stay in my room. I just want to be with my computer. I'm like, I think we have to go to some counselor with that computer thing where they can tell us how many hours you can be on your phone or on your computer, because I think it's sucking the life away of my kids and everything until they say, okay, you need to go talk to somebody. You don't want to talk to us, go talk to somebody, because it's getting scary for me to see you this way. That's not you.
Yeah.
We saw you grow up. Everybody, even in the neighborhood, knows how your spirit is and everything, what's going on. Now, that finding out the loss of her grandma is affecting her. That's when it was like, oh my God, we never even thought that they would really grieve.
Sure.
So, because that's the thing too, we take sometimes our kids feeling for granted. Thinking that, oh, I just told you, you guys will be okay, you'll be okay. Just pray and that's it. By myself, I couldn't go. I have to, like I said, go back home even twice in the same year. And that's a lot of money.
Right.
Going to Africa and coming back, but I wasn't sure if it was real. So I was like, okay, you went there, you have a family around you, embracing you, making you feel like, okay, everything will be okay. Okay, let's give her the proper burial and everything. After all of this, I'm like, wait a minute. What just happened? She's really gone.
Right.
Yeah.
The shock.
She's really gone. I don't understand this. So yeah, it was really. But yeah, prayers been helping me. That's for sure.
Yeah.
It makes you love him more. And like you guys said, you don't have to question everything. Or even when you pray, you don't have to have all the answers coming to you. Or maybe the answers even are coming back because it's not what I was hoping for. I'm not even going to listen to what answer maybe he's giving me, but he's there. He really answers prayers. So thank you for this. It was really an eye-opening.
That's awesome. Do you all have any thoughts or questions, comments?
I guess with what you were saying with
Miss Shannon.
how like her faith, I guess she was frustrated. That's definitely something similar that I went through. But I guess to hear kind of like you still struggle with it, but you still kind of it's hard.
Yeah.
It is.
Yeah.
It is. But the thing that I love about God is he already, even before I said it, he already knew it.
Yeah.
And I tell people becoming a parent changed my life because it changed how I viewed God. And so I look at my children and I don't always do what they want. And they're not always happy with my decision as mommy.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, they know, they don't doubt my love for them. that's what I finally had to get. And I finally had to realize, as my Heavenly Father, God is just, He's not always going to do what I want. And He has the authority
Yeah.
Yes.
to do it the way He wants to do it, but it doesn't change His love for
Yeah.
me. And I grappled with that, and I struggled with that. But like I said, I still struggle with, I very much rather would have preferred Him to do it the way that I want.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, I want my mommy back.
Mhm.
And I can't have it.
Now you pray like if
Yeah.
it was the biblical time where it was Lazarus, like, can you do what you do?
Right.
Yeah.
Like, come on.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, so it's and I guess that's the thing. Sitting here looking at you, what I appreciate is your ability to be authentic in where you are.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because that's the only way that you're going to get through that. If you're not authentic in where you are and in that hurt, in that pain, and to say, this hurts me and I need to cry. And then to surround yourself with people that say, and that's okay.
Yeah.
And that's the only way you're going to find healing.
And I think it's great to know that God is able, as Shannon is saying, to handle us wherever we're at, even when we're hurting. Sometimes we don't want to turn to people because we feel like what I'm feeling is too much, or I need to shelter you from what I'm feeling.
Yeah.
So I'm in a bad place right now. I know you only human, so it's only so much I'm going to tell you.
Right.
Because I don't want to put what I'm feeling on you on top of what you're feeling. But the Bible says that we can cast our cares on Him because He cares for us. And so He's able. And God is not human, so He doesn't have the limitations that humans have. We get tired. We get frustrated. We get overwhelmed. We get, we're human. But God is superhuman. And so we can literally go to Him any time of day with anything that we're feeling. No matter how often it is, like she said, sometimes it's every 2 minutes. He doesn't get frustrated and say, you just talked to me 2 minutes ago.
Right.
Now it's 2 minutes later. We can go to Him with the smallest of things to the largest of things. And it doesn't matter where we're at in our relationship with Him, what age we are, what it is that we're dealing with. He's able to handle all of it. All of it. It's pretty awesome when you think about it. All of us in the room, and He's able to, right now, touch each one of us individually right where we're at with what it is that we're dealing with.
And I think sometimes, even just hearing your mom talk about you, there's a piece of you that almost reminds me of me. When we're used to being the carriers. So I'm used to being the carrier. I'm used to being I was the one, all my friends come to me. I carry everybody else's burdens. I carry everybody else's problems. So I'm not going to be that one. That's why the how are you would trigger me, because I wasn't used to being the one to say to somebody else.
Right.
I was used to the one, everybody else came to me with their problems. And I carried everybody else's stuff. So I didn't know how to transition and be honest enough to say,